So even if we reach net zero emission, the Earth's climate will keep on changing for hundreds of years. It will not just stop heating right away. In fact, some other places like Australia will keep on warming for more than compared to other regions. For example, if we hit net zero emission by 2060, Melbourne could still warm up for a couple degrees over time. Now, the oceans will keep on heating up for long after emissions fall to zero. This means Arctic Sea might not be stabilized, but Arctic Sea is likely to keep on melting, and Australia's climate could still see shifts in terms of rainfall, with winter rainfall keep on increasing even while some areas have been drying out in recent years. Now, each day, the more that we keep on delaying to reach our net zero target, that means that the longer term and more consequences will come along the way. So for just few years could mean higher temperature, warmer oceans, and even less sea ice for centuries. Now, we have to truly understand how climate might change. In fact, some scientists suggested that we need more research, especially to explore what might happen if we can start pulling more carbon out of the air than we emit. But one thing that is clear is that the faster we get into net zero, the better. The sooner we act, the less damage will be passing onto the future. Now, ladies and gentlemen, as usual, every time I always have a person just beside me who stop by for a conversation, and today I'm so excited to invite a friend of mine, but also a colleague, Dr. Andrew King. He is a lecturer and a researcher in climate science and in climate science, especially in the Department of Geography, Earth and Atmospheric Science at the University of Melbourne. Dr. King focused more on climate projection under the Paris Agreement, especially on how the rate of global warming impacts region climate change and the prediction of extreme climate events. He had a PhD actually from the University of New South Wales and experienced more meteorological, including years at the University of Reading in Oklahoma. King, he is also a member of Australian Meteorological and Oceanography Society. We are so excited to dive deep into new sighting research that he just found out. Andrew, how are you?
Good. Yeah, how are you?
I hope that introduction didn't leave something else.
Oh, no, that was a good intro.
And I was just trying to put some information together. So you have a new research publication. And the concept of your publication is actually what made me want to sit down and have a conversation with you. The concept of net zero actually emission. While net zero is a very important thing actually in our climate, for our climate and in our world in general, but you suggested that reaching net zero emission will not be the ultimate it will not stop the climate change instantly. Sorry. Can you just try to elaborate more on that?
Sure. So I think just going into this study, one thing that had surprised me is that we don't actually know very much about how the climate evolves under net zero emissions, even though it's kind of the goal of all of our policies, and countries like Australia, many other countries around the world aiming for net zero by 2050. But we didn't previously have a great understanding of what that actually meant for the climate. So we decided, a group of us decided to do some model simulations using the Australian climate model to try and better understand what actually happens to the climate under net zero emissions.
Okay.
So we just had this paper published a few weeks ago now in Earth System Dynamics that we kind of explore this. And I think what's clear is that net zero alone isn't really enough to halt dangerous climate changes. We can see that many parts of the world continue to warm even under net zero emissions, and there are changes that would continue. So it really shows the urgency of not only trying to reach net zero as soon as possible, but also trying to take up more carbon than we emit.
For someone who don't know, actually, what do we mean when we're talking net zero? When we're saying net zero, what actually do we mean when you say, okay, we have a target, we want to reach net zero? What is it?
Yeah, so net zero simply means that humanity would be putting out the same amount of carbon into the atmosphere as we take up from the atmosphere through our activities. At the moment, humans emit far more carbon than we actively remove from the atmosphere. In fact, just recently, there's been a new report come out that says that 2024 greenhouse gas emissions are likely to be highest on record globally. So we're not really close to the net zero target, but if we were to achieve net zero, it would mean we were taking up as much carbon as we were emitting. So that can be in different ways. Like, we could emit a very small amount of carbon and then we don't need to take up very much to achieve net zero, or we could keep emitting huge amounts of carbon, but then we would need to become really good at taking out extra carbon from the atmosphere.
So here's the point. There is the question that I've seen people asking on the social medias, Twitter and Instagram. The concept when you're talking about emissions, especially carbon dioxide emissions to the atmosphere, there are two sources. If we can divide it, there are sources that come from natural sources, and then we have the one that we create based on our daily activities, driving, cooking, industries, and other kind of activities that involve human being engineering, ingenuity, So the question that someone may ask, we have a target to reach net zero, but the emission sources come from both sides, natural and man-made. Is it possible to reach net zero? And if it is possible, there is one that we can control, the one that we're emitting, and there is another one that we cannot control, the one from natural resources, from volcanic eruption, dust, and marine life, biology, and all that kind of stuff. How can we put this into perspective of net zero?
So technically net zero is just about the humanity side of that, not the natural world side. At the moment, the natural world acts in general as a carbon sink. So the ocean takes up carbon quite effectively, and the land to some extent does, although as you're saying, we don't have control over it, and sometimes we get carbon being emitted from say fires on the land in quite large quantities, but that's kind of separate to what we're thinking of when we typically think about net zero. But it does pose some interesting questions, especially if we think that fires will worsen with climate change. The effectiveness of the natural Earth processes in taking up carbon may be altered, but just by the fact that we're warming the planet. And there's a huge amount of research going into trying to understand this better. And whilst it's not kind of formally part of the definition of net zero, it's definitely something we need to be thinking about when we want to understand future climate changes.
So we are talking, it's a balance between what we are doing and what nature is doing. So what, if I might understand correctly, is that nature have a balance on anything. Yes, there is an emission from the different sources, but also balance. It sucks the carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. While for us, we are doing in the opposite way. We just emit.
Broadly, yeah, we emit far more than we take up. So there are different ways that humanity could go about trying to take out carbon from the atmosphere. So some ways we can already do, like through adding extra vegetation that is effective at taking up carbon and is a long-term store. So we do reforest areas and that kind of thing in some parts of the world. But then there are other kind of approaches, including trying to directly capture air and take carbon out of the air, and that's much harder and more expensive. But if we could do that in a way that was quite efficient and allowed us to store carbon for very long periods of time, that could be part of the solution. At the moment, though, by far the easiest thing we can do is just reduce our emissions. That's kind of the clearest path to net zero that humanity has. And it doesn't... there's a lot of potentially easy wins in the sense that we emit carbon that we don't need to be emitting, and we need to get better at.
What do you mean when you say emit carbon that we don't need to emit?
Well, there are some industries where it's going to be very hard for us to decarbonize, but there are other industries where we still needlessly emit carbon into the atmosphere. So we still use, globally, we still use coal, oil and gas for electricity generation, but we have technologies that mean that we don't really need to do that. So that's kind of, I would say, carbon we don't need to emit that we're still emitting, whereas there's other sources of carbon where it's harder. The aviation industry, it would be, at the moment, with existing technologies, it would be hard to get the aviation industry to net zero in itself.
Definitely.
There are, improvements going on in terms of efficiency, but that's not really the same as like with electricity generation, where we have an easy alternative and we're not taking it. With some industries like aviation, we don't really have that alternative yet.
Okay. So why Australia will continue to be warming more compared to any other part in the world?
Right. So just going back to our study, so we ran these model simulations under net zero emissions for 1,000 years to try and understand long-term impacts, and we did this starting from different points in the 21st century to see the effect of delay in achieving net zero. And we kind of had a look at the response of the climate system to net zero. And one thing that we discovered was that not everywhere has the same response to net zero. There's quite a lot of spatial variability. So some parts of the world, temperature won't change very much. Other parts of the world, it will continue to warm. And Australia stands out, particularly southern Australia, as one of the few regions expected to really significantly continue to warm under net zero. The reason for that is basically our location in the southern hemisphere, and the fact that we have lots of ocean in the southern hemisphere relative to the northern hemisphere, which is has quite large land masses. Under net zero emissions, we anticipate that the ocean will continue to warm for centuries. And because of our proximity to the Southern Ocean, which is an area particularly expected to warm, even relative to other oceans, and just because we're so near to it, Australia kind of feels the effect of that warming as well. So as you were saying, back at the beginning, Melbourne, we kind of expect to continue warming for many centuries under net zero, possibly by 1 or 2 degrees over 1,000 years.
So, I mean, okay, we're located in the southern hemisphere, and we're more vulnerable, we can say, just because of our location, where we are, and the fact that we know a huge part of the Earth climate, ocean plays a huge part in Earth climate. But if someone who don't study, meteorology and everything, and ask a question, why oceans plays a huge part in Earth climate, and it will be more problematic when it comes for climate change, when you're talking about ice and oceans, why they play a huge part in Earth climate?
Yeah, so the Earth system is quite complicated, and but we do see some kind of different aspects of the climate respond differently to carbon emissions. At the moment, we're warming the planet very rapidly, and the land is warming faster than the ocean.
Okay.
Part of that is because the ocean has a lot of inertia. It's very big and slow to evolve. It doesn't. It takes up heat and redistributes it fairly effectively, whereas the land kind of just warms up quicker in response to carbon emissions. So whilst we're continuing to emit huge amounts of carbon and warming the planet, we're seeing the land warming faster than the ocean. But under net zero emissions, the land responds quite quickly to stop warming as much, especially in areas far from the ocean. We don't really anticipate the temperatures to change too much under net zero emissions. But the ocean, because it's got so much inertia, it just keeps warming and warming for hundreds of years, even thousands of years under net zero emissions. So it's partly because it's so effective at redistributing that heat that where we have rising ocean waters, so what we call upwelling, where the ocean waters at the surface are coming from the subsurface, from deeper down. That water is kind of has really seen the state of the climate hundreds of years ago. It's such a slow circulation. But what that means is that water, when it's rising in hundreds of years' time, is it lasts all the atmosphere, maybe in today's climate. So it's kind of just a very, very slow, some scientists have likened it to like a freight train. It's very hard to stop once it starts warming. It starts off slowly, but just continues for a very long time.
So it is just like boiling your water. Once you stop the heat, the water won't just be cooling instantly. It'll continue to be warming up, and it will take some time until it just cooled down.
Yeah, it's kind of I'm not sure what the best analogy for it is. I quite like the freight train analogy. If you compare like or like a car and a truck driving along, the truck takes longer to accelerate. It's bigger, it's heavier, and then when the car brakes, it can brake quicker than a big truck can brake. The truck takes longer to slow down. It's kind of a bit more like that. I think that's
So in this example, what is the car and what is
I'm sorry. So the car is like the land surface response to carbon in the atmosphere. Carbon increases in the atmosphere, so the car can accelerate quickly when a bit like the land warms up quickly, and then it can brake fairly quickly when we turn off emissions. Whereas the ocean is more like the track; it's kind of slower to warm up, but it's harder to stop as well.
So we are just like in the timeline game, just like we are playing the game that called timeline. The longer you delay, the more affected you could become. The quicker you delay, the quicker you react, the quicker a little bit it may take for the results to come along the way, even though it will take some time.
Yeah, it's one of the very clearest results from our study is that if you delay reaching net zero emissions, you see effects for hundreds of years, even possibly thousands of years. We only ran the simulations for 1,000 years, but we can see some aspects of the climate still diverging. Just a 5-year delay in achieving net zero will have very long-lasting effects for centuries.
That doesn't sound good.
No, it really shows how pivotal our current decisions are. Especially in the case where we might struggle to achieve net negative emissions on a large scale. If the quite plausible case where we can maybe try and get down towards net zero, but we really, really struggle to get beyond net zero in terms of our emissions. This really highlights that any delay in our efforts to achieve net zero, it's not only the next generation that will experience, it's people in hundreds of years will still be experiencing those effects of our delay.
You have had another concept in there. I think we need to make it super clear. We have net zero and then we have net negative zero. What is net negative zero?
So net negative, is just where it's the idea that we might be able to take up more carbon than we emit. So net zero is where those two things are balanced, where our carbon emissions into the atmosphere are balanced by the uptake of carbon from the atmosphere by humans. Net negative emissions is where we don't emit very much carbon into the atmosphere, but we take up more carbon than we emit through technologies and through other changes that humanity makes. If we were able to achieve net negative emissions, we might be able to start cooling the planet back down again. But it really is an idea that at the moment feels a bit like science fiction. It requires technologies that just don't really seem plausible on a large scale. So really, I mean, hopefully, as technology continues to develop, we can start getting better at taking carbon out of the atmosphere, and maybe start to, hopefully reach a point where we do have net negative emissions and we can cool the planet back down. But in the meantime, I think our study is useful in kind of examining, in a somewhat idealized sense, what would happen if we struggle to do that. If we can achieve net zero, but we can't really go beyond net zero.
Okay. Let me read something. It's a tweet. I won't say who tweeted it, but it's a tweet. So just listen and tell me. We have people with a very powerful power that they can change with an instant of their decision. When they decide that we are going on this direction, yes, it can. Now here's the tweet, and I quote, "We must reject the perennial prophets of doom and their predictions of the apocalypse. I don't believe in it." The concept of global warming was created was created by and for the Chinese in order to make US manufacturing non-competitive. I don't think it's a hoax. It's a hoax. I think there is probably a difference, but I don't know. That is a man-made. The environment is very important to me. Someone wrote a book that I am an environmentalist. It's freezing in New York. Where the hell is going warm? And then the badly flawed Paris climate agreements protected the polluters, hurts Americans, and cost fortunes not only on my watch. I can't say who wrote that tweet, but you have really idea who really wrote that. So, what do you think about it?
I mean, I think part of the problem we have is we have a huge base of climate science now that shows how damaging our emissions are to the planet. Scientists don't really dispute this. We argue about kind of minutiae and details a lot, like in very kind of second, third order effects of climate change. But the basic idea, we all, there's so much evidence to support the fact that we're damaging the planet through our emissions. It's we just, that's accepted. So I think the problem is that if you look, we see this, we look at data from across the world, we look at our understanding of the climate system, we see all of this evidence for how damaging our effects are. But if you're just in your kind of spot on the planet and you experience cold weather, it's not necessarily obvious to you that the world is warming, I guess. But that doesn't really change the fact it's warming.
Okay.
So we shouldn't. That's not just that relevant. It's really about the global picture, not just what's happening very, very locally. And I think it's really dangerous that we have leaders around the world trying to slow down in action to tackle climate change. We've shown in this study, but also, there's lots of other work that we know that if we reach net zero sooner, we can avoid the worst impacts of climate change. If we delay reaching net zero, we're in big trouble. What our study shows is that we're in trouble for a very long time if we delay achieving net zero. People who aren't scientists, who kind of try and comment and kind of put out this information, it's very dangerous.
And one thing that I can say, it is, there's a lot of misinformation going on in media right now. Since nowadays, the accessibility of information, it's very easy people to access information if you just have internet anywhere in the world. And most people, I think, most people do not find accurate information. And the reason towards I think it's because most people, first of all, don't like reading articles, do not like reading scientific published information, and most people like already digested informations, like someone just read and then give the comment. I think most people are affected with the people's perceptions concerning different issues in our world, and most people are affected because of the mass influence a lot of people have, and they believe that, okay, if someone says something, I'm going to believe what he says more than believing what he says, and that puts scientists in a track that are not believed.
There's quite a lot to unpack there. So there is it's definitely changed how people get information and news, and I think lots of people aren't great at evaluating whether their source of information or news is trustworthy, and whether they may be biased. due to, certain interests. So it becomes tricky, I think, for scientists who we hold a lot of knowledge that is really useful and we want people to know, but it's hard to communicate and cut through. I think it's really important for scientists to try and do this. And we have to use all sorts of media to try and do this, and it should be a major part of our jobs.
It is.
But it is challenging, and it's often a bit demoralizing as well.
Definitely. I agreed on that.
But it's just vital that we keep doing this.
Yeah. So we have done a good job. You have done an amazing work, and congratulations for that. And I'm pretty sure that when once we post this podcast online, I will also include the link of where people can read more information concerning what the publication it is. Now, if you have an opportunity to talk to Australians first and then all around the world, to tell people in a very short summary what your research says and what actually you think about it. As we are moving forward towards facing the struggle for climate change, and we are moving forward to develop good strategies, adaptation and mitigation strategies, what would be the message?
That's a good question. So I think our study shows just how imperative it is that we greatly reduce our emissions as fast as possible. If delaying achieving net zero has massive long-term consequences for centuries, maybe even millennia.
Okay.
So the actions we take now will have a very long-lasting influence. We need to act as quickly as possible. We also know that because we've got these long-term changes, we are going to have to adapt to some climate changes. We can't just mitigate all impacts of climate change. We have to adapt, and we have to get better at adapting, and make sure that it's not the way that just the richest countries spend lots of money on adaptation locally that prevents their worst impacts, but the impacts are really felt just by the world's poorest. We have to make sure that the nations that haven't caused the problem but are experiencing the worst burdens of climate change
definitely
are supported. And I mean, this is the whole point of the loss and damage fund, but it's going to keep becoming more and more critical.
This is one thing that I really like this phrase, and I like to use it over and over, and I think people will continue hearing this from me. Those who controls the printed pages controls the thinking of ages. Now, it is up to us to make a decision, because this is a two-way road. One, that we are the driver, because it's a two levels. It's an individual and it's a collective as a society. As an individual, you just have to understand that you are the driver. The industry that produces more carbon dioxide actually from manufacturing of the things that you really want to use on your daily basis. And the concept is actually this: they cannot produce what you don't demand. You demand, and that's why they produce. The more they produce, the more they pollute. In a simple way, the more you demand, the more you make them pollute. Now, they do business. They have to find the cheapest and the easiest way to provide more products for less cost, and they can make more. And if that is the case, most of the cheapest way right now, it has been for hundreds of years, are the one that cost us a lot. Now, we might debate a lot, like, okay, Earth itself produces carbon dioxide and everything, but we have to understand anything natural always comes with a balance. Yes, it does pollute, and at the same time, it manage and balance each and everything. For example, if you really want to understand, just go and read the climate change. The weather and the climate when during most of our volcanic eruptions, the heavy volcanic eruptions events over the world. And over the time, yes, it produced a lot of sulfur, a lot of carbon, but at the same time, it produced something else different and beautiful. It created lands. At the same time, it managed the Earth's climate. So there is a balance in nature where we are trying to find our balance. And we cannot find the balance if we don't provide enough information to people. Now understand, anything you consume, you make them pollute, you make them produce, and you make them pollute. I spoke to Robin last time, and Rob the other time before that one, that people are more triggered with the final product. Yes, electric car reduce the exhausting, the production of NO2 and all that kind of pollutant, but we are constantly focusing on the final product, and we forget to look on the whole process that has made the final product. There is extraction of materials, there is a pre-processing, there is the processing, and there is the final product. We have a final product, yes, but the whole process that makes the final product is the problem. So we have a lot to fix now. Based on the findings of this new research, make it super easy and simple and clear for people to understand that we are playing the game called timeline. The longer we delay, the more impact we put into ourselves. And I think this is just like a simple question. You are holding electric cable. The longer you hold it, the more you'll be electrocuted. The sooner you release it, the sooner the impact reduced. Everything falls onto you, everything falls onto us. Now we in Australia will be more affected compared to any other parts of the world because of where we are located. We have a lot to talk, and I really wish that next week we can have Andrew King have more discussion concerning climate change, especially what kind of extreme climate that we can expect after we reach net zero. We have a lot to discuss and we have a lot to learn. It is my obligation and duties to make sure that you have a clear and a very good information from the people who actually developed and devoted their work to find information and then to bring it up into open areas for you to read and understand what is actually going on. It's up to you to dig deep and to understand, find accurate information so as you can have accurate decisions on your daily life. Remember, the lives of your future generations depends on what you are doing today. I wish you a very beautiful and amazing weekend. See you next time and next week. Andrew, do you have any final thing to say?
Not really. I think you summarized it all very well there. Thanks for having me on, Simon.
I hope that next week you can spare some time. I want us to talk about, okay, we've reached net zero. It will continue to warming up. What kind of extreme climate we can expect into the future, and what kind of adaptation and mitigation strategies we can develop to make sure that we are not impacted highly.
Very happy to talk about that.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for tuning in, and thank you so much for listening. This is Gaia's Tales, and I'm your host, Simon. See you until next time. Bye-bye.